I want to thank you all for having me. I want to touch on many of the issues that we've been talking about today from a little bit different vantage point. As she said, my framework here is really about hacking and monopoly and justice and joy. And when I say the word hacking, many of you probably conjure an image that looks something like this. Some kind of hooded technical person going after some kind of nefarious behavior. But when I think about hacking, I think of it a little bit differently. After spending a couple of decades in Silicon Valley, I have a broader conception of hacking. I think about using systems creatively to achieve what you want to achieve, regardless of what those systems are designed for. It's really about mastery of systems. And so I think monopoly is actually a useful metaphor for this. So I want to tell you a little story, true story, about playing Monopoly with my family, which changed my view. So I'm playing with my wife, my two daughters. This is, my youngest turned 10 yesterday, so this was probably 4 years ago or so. My younger was about 6, the older one's around 7, and my wife. My younger daughter just learned to read. She's the least cognitively developed of the whole family. And so no surprise, by the time we got to the point in the game where everyone owns the property and it really starts getting into the good stuff, my younger daughter, Ella, is the first one to go out. She's bankrupt, and she's 6. So what does she do? She breaks down and starts crying, of course, right? Like this is, you know. And so I'm her dad. I'm saying, you know, like dad, I'm looking at my baby girl in complete abject terror and dejection. And so what do? I say, okay, Ella, take your properties and you come sit with daddy and we'll play together. Okay, so she comes and sits on my knee and we continue playing. We go on for another 10, 15 minutes, and lo and behold, the exact same thing happens with my next daughter. And she breaks out into tears and she starts crying. This feels awful. So I say to Cleo, my older daughter, okay, Cleo, take your properties, you come sit with daddy, we'll play together. So the unintended consequence of this is now it's daddy and Ella and Cleo against mommy. I definitely didn't plan for that. And when that happened, I had an epiphany, which is I realized that we were playing that game entirely wrong. We already owned all the property. And it was the 3 of us against mommy, and that's not fun, that's not joyful. And it occurred to me, why are we even doing this? I think we're playing the game the wrong way. And I said to my daughters, why are we playing against mommy when really we could be playing against the bank? And I realized, there's an opportunity to hack this game, hack the way we're playing the game. And it occurred to me, I could kind of see the math in my head when this happened. This is what I thought about. I saw a formula in my head. It's BB over P times V equals lots. BB is the bank balance sheet. P is the number of players in the game. V is the value per lap, which you know in Monopoly you get $200. And I realized if you just have this simple shift in perspective, you can actually hack the way you play the game Monopoly. And so lots is the number of laps it takes to own the whole bank. And so you can define with specificity how long it takes to own the whole thing. And the answer is, it's not that long. If you run that formula with the amount of money you have in any Monopoly game, with just a few players, it doesn't take long to solve the whole game and control the whole puzzle. To me, that's hacking, and the way we ought to think about hacking. And it's a metaphor for the way we could be thinking about impact investing, changing the whole system. And so I'm speaking in metaphor, but also reality, because a lot of the work that I've been doing for the past 2 decades has been focused on a different sort of hacking and a different game of Monopoly, a different field of play, which is largely focused on East Palo Alto, which is in the middle of Silicon Valley. And one of the peculiar things about East Palo Alto is it is divided by a freeway. Many of you have been there and will know what I'm talking about. Where on one side in Palo Alto, there's extreme wealth, and on the east side of the freeway, there is the opposite of that. In just about any way you measure it, whether it's access to grocery stores or water or schools or criminal justice activity or any number of things. And one of the things that I realized after years of working on this is that the scenario in East Palo Alto is not unique in any way. There are a host of cities that have this dynamic where the marginalized folks tend to be on the east side of communities. So here in DC, Southeast DC would be an example of that. And I see heads nodding in the crowd. I would ask you, if you can't imagine some community that you know of that's on the, quote, other side of the tracks, raise your hand. And no one raises their hand, right? You all understand what I'm talking about. This is just a smattering of the cities. The reality is if I listed them all, this entire map would be orange. And really what I was trying to do is just illustrate the point. And so I went with an early onset measles aesthetic. But you get the point that this happens everywhere, right? And the dynamic is actually at its core about some basic physical attributes of our Earth. The Earth spins counterclockwise. If you looked at the lateral aspect of this, what it looks like is the wind, and this is true in the northern and southern hemispheres. It's a little different around the equatorial regions, but as a general matter, in the northern and southern hemispheres, the wind blows from the west to the east. And so the way to think about this is imagine we were all sitting in a giant circle around a campfire. The campfire is warm, and we all want to be warm, and so we need to be close to it. But the wind's blowing to the east. And so the question is, well, who sits with the smoke blowing in their face? And the answer to that riddle is people with less power. And that dynamic is playing out in all of those places that you imagined when I asked the question of whether you can imagine a community on the other side of the tracks. It's playing out everywhere across the US. It's also a global phenomenon. It's true on the east side of Paris and London and Vancouver and Jerusalem, Bombay, and on and on and on. It's a global phenomenon, again, in the northern and southern hemispheres. And this is a phenomenon that's been documented not just by me, but others around the world, including the Spatial Economics Research Center in the UK and other places. It's so deep that it's been embedded in our cultures. I mean, we already shared this. I said the other side of the tracks, and everyone knew what I was talking about. So I'm a linguistic anthropologist by training. I thought, well, where does that come from? And I pulled that thread and understood the etymology of it. It actually comes from this, which is trains. And the way that trains were architected to go into communities. And as a general matter, the wind, again, like the campfire metaphor, blowing particulate matter to the east, created the sense of the wrong side of the tracks. And so I've literally interviewed people who told me stories of their, grandparents who would go have to pull in the laundry from the clothesline based on the train schedule, because all the soot would mess up their clothes, and this is sort of the reality that led to this. What I know from talking about this also is that somebody is sitting out here thinking, well, what about the west side? What about the Upper East Side in New York? And what I would say to that is, I'm trying to make a general point about disparity by design, right? So I was born on the south side of Chicago, which is not the east side by name, but if you were in the south side and you went any further east, you would be in Lake Michigan. The south side is actually the east side, but the west side of Chicago is also one of these marginalized communities. So the point that I'm making is less about a cardinal direction. The point that I'm making is if you go to a place and you get in a taxi and you ask the taxi driver, where are the poor folks? If they answer that question and point in any direction, That's what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the train tracks. I'm talking about the river. I'm talking about the freeway. I'm talking about all the full complement of architectural affordances that divide the haves from the have-nots. And these are human design decisions. This is a picture from Brazil where you can see the abutment of wealth versus the antithesis of that. This is a picture of Menlo Park in California at the border of East Palo Alto, and you can see how sharp the distinction is. These are human, architectural, policy, economic design decisions that separate the haves from the have-nots. I came here to DC from Montgomery, Alabama yesterday, where I recently spent a bunch of time studying the history of slavery and the related economics and the laws associated with that, visiting the lynching memorial and museum there. And it's crystal clear that in this country, we have never really tried the experiment of designing communities that work for everyone. The history of this country is one of having a first principle of design that there will be haves and there will be have-nots. That has been the design framework that we have worked with, and it's something that we can get away from in this moment. That approach, those first principles of have and have-nots have pervaded all aspects of our society, including and especially the way that we manage our financial system. So these are maps, these are redlining maps, which our federal government supported and sanctioned. These maps told banks where they should not lend. And if you notice the red, which is sort of the no-lend zone, which is why they call it redlining, tends to be clustered on the east sides of these cities. And it's just one example of the perverse design that we've used to structure our financial systems. And it's a design behavior that we continue to this day. And I won't go into all the perversities that I saw and think about from Montgomery, but I think about some of the policy frameworks that are in play today. So for example, opportunity zones, which are significantly targeted towards these East Side communities. But I also think about the rules of the game. How are we playing Monopoly? What needs to be hacked? And I think about the fact that it's not possible to participate in investing in opportunity zones unless you have wealth that was created from already having wealth. That's a broken design. That's something that needs to be hacked and worked around. In aggregate, when we look at the complement of our history and the range of policies and laws and behaviors and investments, I think this is what we've been doing. We've been rudely blowing smoke in the faces of folks in marginalized communities and then continuing to marginalize them. So I go back to that hacking metaphor and I think about how we use design, how we have different first principles to approach these problems. And so let's go back to that campfire metaphor and I think, well, how would you play that differently? A simple way to do that would be just sit in a horseshoe. So simple. It's like playing Monopoly with the kids and saying like, hey, you guys, let's actually play against the bank. And you realize with just a simple shift in perspective, you can radically change systems, right? So 2 points about this. One, which I've said before, I'm speaking in metaphor, but I want to be explicit. The point of this is not to say that you get to go into East Side communities and just move people out of the way. That's absolutely not the point. And I think the opposite is true and desperately needed, particularly in this moment that we're in this country, which is one of the greatest things we can do right now, one of the most powerful things we can do right now is get a little closer to each other. It actually makes space, and that's a powerful move. So I go back and I think about these divisions that mark not just East Palo Alto, but East Side communities in general. And as a general matter, as I said, this is about disparity by design, but I think there's an opportunity to translate that into prosperity by design. And I think that's the work of impact investing. That's the work of our community as a collective. So I want to give just one example from the bronze portfolio of what that looks like in reality. So I show this picture of a plate and a knife and fork. And that is a reminder to me that if I were to take you as my guest today in East Palo Alto, there are only 2 places to eat with a metal knife and fork. One is on the west side of the freeway, which isn't broadly regarded as East Palo Alto, but it technically is, inside the Four Seasons Hotel. The only other place to eat with a knife and fork is in the IKEA cafeteria up on the 2nd floor. Other than that, your dining options are Pizza Hut, McDonald's, Taco Bell, etc. It's a food desert. And one of the consequences of that, besides being inconvenient and making it difficult for me as a father to teach my children how to design, how to dine, is that the community radically over-indexes for diabetes because the food is laden with, it's nutritionally poor. So we think about type 2 diabetes, which is, a terrible disease. The reversal rate for diabetes is 0.4%. So around that, it's 0. Like you can't reverse diabetes. What the usual suspects in the medical establishment will tell you is you can manage it. You can take some drugs and we can try to control it, but it's not regarded broadly as a condition that you can resolve. We're spending in the US right now over $400 billion every year to manage type 2 diabetes, not reverse it. We've got an investment in our portfolio, a company called Virta. And what Virta does is they use a technology that can be delivered over your phone and some diet and behavior, and basically it's a medical clinic in your phone that has generated a reversal rate of 60%. So 60% reversal versus 0.4%. And I'm saying reversal, not management. The company's goal is to reverse type 2 diabetes in 100 million people by 2025. And they're well on the way to that. And the attendant economics are quite attractive. And I think this is an example of the kind of investment that we get really excited about. My view of, there are lots of definitions of impact. My view of impact is an incremental unit of revenue drives an incremental unit of impact, and vice versa. So every time we sell treat another person with the Virta program and reverse their diabetes, it's driving revenue and profitability for the company, and vice versa. That's the ideal state that we want to be investing in. And so I think at the end of the day, we have an opportunity to pursue justice, which is a cousin to hope. I think about where we are with this East Side work, and part of what gives me hope is that after years of work, people are starting to understand the injustice of the frameworks that we've been trying to fight against and redesign. We've built an East Side Alliance, and people are starting to really get behind our work. Certainly the Aspen Institute and Prudential, who has invested in us, and the Aspen Institute, where I've been a fellow for, a decade and a half. And I'm grateful for their support and continued support. Universities, certainly companies, and community activists are getting behind us in this East Side movement. And I'm particularly grateful that it's starting to turn into a movement, and we're seeing evidence of that. The beginning of it last year, around graduation time, I got an email from a friend, and she said, I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, the UPenn, graduation. And the graduation speaker is talking about East Side stuff. I had no idea. 2 weeks ago, I got a text message from the guy who runs environment work for Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles, and he sent a little film clip of a graduation ceremony for an incubator that they're running down there. And he said, we've been using your East Side talk as part of our education program here, and this is the graduation speech, and they're talking about East Side. And that is important to me because it is a marker that we're moving from just investment work to movement work. And that suggests to me that we can start getting this to scale. And the other thing that really encourages me is, especially coming from Silicon Valley, the understanding and appreciation that we have a remarkably impressive arsenal of technologies to point at these problems that we're trying to solve. And not only do we have these technologies to point at these problems, but the technologies are getting better and greater in number over time. We have more capabilities to attack the problems and work the puzzles that we're trying to solve in Q1 2020 than we did in Q4 2019. It is moving that fast, and we will have even more in Q2. And so our capabilities are better and better, literally month after month. And so what that suggests to me is the ability to not be incremental about the way we think about this work, to radically imagine what's possible and know that it's not just play and it's not just imagination, but that we actually have the potential today, right now, to solve some of the most intractable problems that face our communities. And that potential gives me, and I hope you, great joy. Thank you.